Hi, welcome to Gospel with Greg. And in the video today, I want to address the question, what if I'm in a place in life I don't like? I think that we all have times at some point, even if they're brief, where we're not, um, complete fans of where our life's at. They're definitely not our favorite times. And this can cover a lot of different things. Maybe you have a job that you don't like. Maybe you're living somewhere you don't like. Maybe there's a certain struggle or problem that's kind of lingering that it's just like, can we get this fixed now? Um, and so it could cover a lot of different things. And, obviously, I can't cover in depth all the different scenarios that could lead to someone not liking where they're at in life. So this is going to kind of be general advice, and it's not going to be so much on how do you fix, the thing you don't like. In depth because you can't really address how do you fix every single problem you could have that's causing you distress in life in one video. But this is more about kind of how we can improve our mentality and our mindset, and kind of emotionally, how do you deal with those seasons while you're in them. And so, again, maybe you have a certain issue in life that you'd prefer that it be fixed quickly, but it's kind of becoming a process, and you kind of don't like where your life's at as you're waiting for that to be resolved. This video is going to kind of, address things to keep in mind to kind of help your mindset while you're dealing with the issue. And so, there could be um, a situation where, and maybe this doesn't apply to everybody watching, but maybe you're kind of going into the season, you're kind of at the beginning of it, and you kind of have this dread of what you anticipate, um, of what's ahead. Maybe you have to start a new job that you're just like, ugh, I am not looking forward to that, or things like that. And it's kind of just like, I know me, I ain't gonna like this place. And something that I would encourage people in that situation to keep in mind is that you don't know with 100% certainty. I've had times before where you know I anticipated, I was about to start something new, and I thought for sure I was going to hate it, but I ended up really loving it. Kind of an example, when I was a kid, my mom signed me up for basketball when I was 10 years old, and I didn't really kind of think of myself as like a sporty kid. And so I just dreaded that, and I just was so sure I was going to hate it. I ended up playing a few seasons of it, and I ended up really loving it. And I remember I was sad when I got to the point where I was too old to play anymore. And I've had situations like that as an adult where maybe there was a job I started where I'm like, I am going to hate this. And it turns out that, I ended up not minding it as much as I thought I would. Even if I didn't fall in love with it, of I want to do this as a career, it got to a point where um, it was much more bearable than in the beginning. And, there were certain things about it that I did come to enjoy, and it taught me lessons and everything. And so I think that that's something to keep in mind, particularly, again, if you're kind of in the beginning phase of whatever this situation is for you. And again, that's going to apply more to certain situations than others. Um, as for, why God allows these situations, particularly if it seems like something really bad, maybe there's a big issue going on in your family, maybe something's going on to where it's kind of uncertain of, this is going to negatively impact my loved ones, whatever the specific situation is. Um, And kind of this question could come up of, this is so distressing, maybe not even just for you, but for the others involved. And you might ask, why is God allowing, you know, this seemingly horrible season in life? And, whatever the reason or reasons are, because there could be multiple reasons as to why God's allowing it to happen, is, we ultimately have to remember that God is all knowing and He's all good, and He's perfect. So whether we know what the reasons are, we can trust that they are good and perfect reasons. And, again, if you're going through a tough time, you might hear that and go, really? That doesn't make me feel better. I need a more concrete, I need to know exactly what the reason is. And that's understandable. Our flesh, when we go through tough things, you know, we kind of have this feeling of like, can I at least know why? Can I know what the purpose is? And, I think there are multiple examples in the Bible, but, we can look at a situation like Job. We can read the whole story of Job and, the preface and the context and things like that, and we know the reasons. And I actually have a whole video on why God allows suffering and why God allowed Job to suffer and things like that. But, I would say, Job probably didn't understand perfectly why all these things were being allowed to happen to him, of losing his loved ones, his health, and all his wealth. And he probably went through something, what he was going through is probably much worse than what any of us are dealing with in our phase of life we don't like. But that was an opportunity for Job to trust in God and to know there were good reasons, even if he didn't know what they were. And, I think that, sometimes we can get into the mindset of, if there's a bad place in life, maybe we accept, oh yeah, that God is allowing it to happen for a good reason. But we kind of jump to the complete negative of, well, I guess I must have messed up because this is clearly a punishment, and, there is, chastisement, to be sure. And, and when God does that, it's in a way that's going to teach us and instruct us to be better. But it's not always, if we go through a place in life that we don't like, if we're in a place in life we don't like, or going through something tough, it's not always God just, whipping us with a paddle spiritually, you know, but, there could be more to it than that, and more to it than we realize. And, maybe as this situation goes on, we might start to learn more. And again, in some cases, like I said closer to the beginning, it might just be initially you don't like it. Not all situations are gonna be like, oh, I hated this, but now I love it. But sometimes that could be the case. And, I've had situations in life too where, maybe I really wanted something and I didn't get it. And, I went through kind of a phase of depression. And, I wouldn't say I eventually got to the point where, I was ecstatic, but I came to learn more about, why that was, and that kind of low place taught me a lot of things. And so that was very instructive. And, and that kind of ties into the next point I want to make, which is, if we're in these, places in life we don't like, we need to make the best of them and learn from them. And, if we're in a bad situation, especially if it's something that we can't stop and we kind of just have to ride it out to the end, it's best to make the best of it. Be an opportunist. Sometimes that can be more difficult, especially if the bad situation isn't your fault. Um, and it can invoke a little bit of frustration maybe to hear that, of, it's like, are you kidding? It's somebody else's fault I'm in this mess and you're telling me to learn a lesson. But, again, you're already in the situation. You might as well make the best of that. And maybe you even want to make the best of it, but you just don't see how you could. You might look around, it's like, I don't see anything good or opportunistic about this situation. But when it comes to making the best of a situation, one way you can do that in pretty much any case is to learn lessons from it, and that can be very valuable because you can use those lessons in future life situations and just grow as a better, wiser instrument of God. And James 1:5 tells us to seek God for wisdom if we're lacking it. And you could say a situation where you have no clue what the point of your situation is definitely an applicable situation to that verse. And we should apply that verse even more. And another passage that kind of goes along with it is one that I've referenced on the channel before. I've even done a whole video on it. Is Matthew chapter 6 verses 19 through 31 in Jesus' Sermon on the Mount, where he says, "Lay not up for yourselves treasures upon earth, where moth and rust doth corrupt, and where thieves break through and steal. But lay up for yourselves treasures in heaven, where neither moth nor rust doth corrupt, and where thieves do not break through nor steal. For where your treasure is, there will your heart be also." And so what we do with our time and energy is very important and can have great consequences. And Jesus really speaks to that here. Ultimately we need to be heavenly minded first. You're not on this earth forever, and you can only, even if you're a good multitasker, you can only, focus your energy on so much. And, not making the best of your situation is wasting the time and energy you have. And it's like choosing to overpay for something or even outright throw your money in the garbage when you don't have to do that. Again, maybe you didn't ask to be in this bad situation and you don't find it, very enjoyable at all, even if you try. But the fact of the matter is you're in it. And unless you know how to build a time machine, you might as well make the best of it. And really, to kind of go along with, time and energy, or like money, that illustration is, we can think of what we do with our time and energy, again, whether we asked for the situation or not, as an investment. When it comes to financial investments, you expect to get what you pay for it in that situation. If you're going on a vacation and you set aside some money, you make a budget of, I'm going to spend this much money to stay in the hotel for 3 days. You are going to stay in that hotel room that you paid for, and you want to have a pleasant experience. You don't pay for a hotel room and then sleep in your car when you're there. That's not making, good use of your financial investment. Or, if you go to a restaurant and you buy an expensive steak dinner, that's an investment. You're not going to order, a $50 expensive meal and then not eat it when they bring it. It's, again, that's just a waste of that investment. But I think we can do that with our time and energy. If you're in this situation in life, again, whether it's good or bad, and in this video we're kind of focusing on the latter, it still involves your time and energy, and that's an investment. And so while it might not be enjoyable, striving to do things like learn what lessons you can, focus on what you already have, the blessings God has already given you, and seeking God's first and put God first, and putting your faith in God. Those efforts are striving to make good use of your investment, your time and energy investment. And kind of another way to look at it too is, Imagine you are trying to get somewhere and you get lost. That's very unpleasant. But what if on this unplanned detour of where you're trying to figure out where to go, you stumble across some gold and it's all yours if you want it? Are you seriously going to say, nah, I don't want that? I didn't ask to be lost. I didn't ask to come this way. Well, maybe you didn't ask to get lost and that's unpleasant, but you're passing up, a free treasure and benefit you could have, in that situation. And, kind of how that parallels with this is maybe you didn't ask for this bad situation. Maybe you don't enjoy it, but maybe there's a unique lesson you could learn in that situation that you wouldn't have learned otherwise. You should make the best of that situation, your time and energy investment, by taking a hold of that. Because it's doubly bad if you just say nope and you turn your back on it. We shouldn't do that. We shouldn't make the situation worse. And that kind of goes into the next point, which is putting things into perspective. I don't know everybody's problem, and, some of them may be real big problems, but one thing I can say is that for many of us that live somewhere like the United States or, any other comparable country, there's a good chance your situation could be a lot worse. There are people throughout the world that, they live in, very dangerous settings. Maybe it's an area, stricken with war, or, maybe there's some kind of disease outbreak and they don't have nearly as good health care to deal with that. Some people, they can't drink tap water, so clean water is something that is more of an effort for them to get a hold of. Maybe food is scarce. They don't know where their next meal is coming from. Some people are homeless and, these different things. And, that's something that, I've really had to think about. And that doesn't mean that what you're dealing with isn't a problem, but I've thought in my case before, I get so upset about certain things that don't go my way, and I've thought, that thing, not going my way is unpleasant, but I have a place to live. I consistently, know where my next meal is coming from. I don't have to worry about where it's coming from. I have clean water to drink. I have a car to get where I'm going. Some people got to walk miles to get anywhere. And, I have clothes on my back and these different things. And, I think again, in places like the United States, for many of us, we just take those for granted. We don't think of those things as blessings. But I think for so many of us, there are blessings all around us that we don't see. And I think that, we do ourselves a service to really stop and think about even just the little blessings we have in our life. And I think that can strengthen our relationship with God when we recognize those things and we say, thank you, Lord, that I was able to eat today, that I had a place that, when I got home from work, whether it was a good or bad day, I had a place to come home to and to lay my head down, at night. And ultimately, if you're saved, that's the greatest gift of all. And, I think that that's something that really gave people like Job and, Joseph in the Old Testament and, different ones like that were going through atrocious situations, physically and earthly, that they ultimately realized this is all just temporary and God and His promises are eternal. And I think that that's, very, very important for us to remember. And I think that, when it comes to, these kinds of situations, it can be really tough because I think we as people, maybe we even try to appreciate what we have, but it just seems difficult. And, I think it's because we can be very short-sighted. but I think it's a mentality that, it might take time to grow in. Maybe you've even tried to start it and it's like, I'm trying to be appreciative, but it's just so hard. I encourage you to just continue in that walk. And, I think that one thing that's a joy when it comes to serving God, and one thing that brings me joy about the fact that I'm imperfect, is that means that I can grow and get even better, you know, and the thought of being able to grow and become a better instrument of God, I think it's very exciting if you look at it the right way. And ultimately we should seek God first, like Matthew 6:33 says, to seek his kingdom first and not seek, comfort or physical blessings first. Maybe God gives you that, but you know, we see that Paul was beaten and was in prison, and he had so much joy. And, he was absolutely not in the best place in life um, because of what he was dealing with, but he was ultimately focused on God first. And that's why he was able to have that joy, where he said things like he could do all things through Christ who strengthens him. And I think that those examples are just so powerful. And, we see in the Bible, like I said just now, Paul beaten and stoned and all these other things and in prison and hated by, different people, was able to have joy. Job lost pretty much everything, and he still stayed faithful to God. And I think that that is so powerful, and that's the power of Christ. If you're going through something tough, even if it seems like a huge battle, you're in good company. You can look all throughout God's word and you can see people that went through some of the worst imaginable situations, but they were able to stay faithful to God and even have joy in the process, in a situation like Paul. And that's ultimately because while your earthly situation might be bad, when Christ is in your life, you have the promise of eternal life ahead of you. And you know, like it says there, that's eternal. Earth is temporal, but your relationship and life with God, that continues far past when you leave this earth. And I think that when we seek God and his kingdom first, and we think of the grand scheme of things, that really dwarfs that problem that we have, regardless of what it is. And so, those are kind of some general kind of mindsets that I kind of studied up on. And again, I know this was kind of broad, but I hope that, if you're really going through a tough place in life, that this was really helpful for you. And always remember that Christ said that he would be with you always. And until next time, God bless.